I just had this experience of we're a very different family. But things like being different or being poor, none of that ever bothered me. But I didn't like when we couldn't pay the rent on time. When the grocery store and you grab your groceries and then you have to put some stuff back. My mom always nurturing and protecting my relationship with my dad. I always was aware of his drinking and also of his tendency to, make a scene. We're always surrounded by this feeling of, unconditional love. Is there something that my dad taught me about life that's still with me now? My parents both grew up without loving parents. Of course, you all know that my father's father was brutal and never expressed affection or love, much less, treated him decently. And his mother didn't protect him really from that. She was also afraid. My mother's mother was widowed when my mom was like 10 years old, and so her dad was gone. And her mom was in the 1930s trying to, take care of her two daughters and make a living at the time was not so common for women to support themselves. She had no desire to get married again. So I think they both grew up without a lot of parenting, period, and definitely without loving parenting. And I grew up with the opposite. They're both poets, and so my life was chaotic in some ways, and it was very different than your average person of my age growing up in California and the United States. But things like being different or being poor, none of that ever bothered me, because we're always surrounded by this feeling of, unconditional love. But really, as a kid, you take that for granted, as you should, right? But it means I can't imagine how you grow into an adult without that. They're both dead, but I still feel, even though I miss my dad and I miss that in-person companionship, conversation, feeling of being protected, like probably any father would want their daughter to feel, or mother, I still have that feeling of protection. It's still with me, and even though I'm a pessimist and I get very depressed, like, actual clinical depression, not a bad mood, and all of those things make life a little bit difficult, right? But I also think everything will be fine because they gave me that. And then I wonder, how did they parent me? Because I parent my kids based on what I learned from them. I try to do what's right, and not just automatically reproduce whatever went into my head. But I learned how to be a good, loving mother from Hank and from my mom. And I don't know how they did it. They had to completely invent themselves. And especially, of course, my dad always wanted to be an outsider. So he did have that, whatever the conventional crowd was doing, that's obviously the wrong way. What his parents did, that's the wrong way. But he really, he invented himself. I guess we all do. But I feel like I have a lot more foundation and support than they do. And I wonder what I would have been like if I grew up like my dad. And I wonder what I would have been like, or what they would have been like if they grew up like I did. It's an impossible question, right? But it's really strange to think about, because I'm just in this position of being Bukowski's daughter, and I was brought up to be loved by him and to respect him and revere him as one of the best writers in the world. And I took that for granted from such a young age that I can't remember, going from sort of that really young childhood view of your parents as can do no wrong to, oh yeah, parents are human. They can do a lot of things wrong, and they do, right? And I certainly do all the time. But I never lost that feeling of, gratitude and admiration for who my father was. So I'm very lucky. And I did always know that, even though sometimes as a very shy little girl, that's where I got my fabulous fear of public speaking. Right? At least from when I was 6 years old onwards, I was a very shy little girl. So sometimes I wish that I could fit in. I don't like people to pay attention to me, right? I don't want to be observed because I might do the wrong thing. When you're shy, you just want to be blend into the wall. And you can't completely blend into the wall when you're Bukowski's daughter, even when you're 5 years old, right? Today, I feel a sense of community, even though there's a lot of you here that I don't know. But it does remind me of how I grew up around poets and writers. Now, that's mostly thank you to my mom, because my dad did not like to hang out with other writers in general. He was like, blah, 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 blah. You should just write something. Why are we talking about writing? So, what else would you like to know from the daughter? Speak up. That's right. That's right. Well, they're very short because they're really like flashes of memories. The anecdotes are more things that are retold by my mom and my dad. But my first, and maybe this is a memory of the story too, but I remember, I think, lying on the bed in between my mom and dad. They were sitting and talking, and I'm lying on the bed and they're eating potato chips. And at some point, I became fascinated with like the stained glass effect of the potato chips in the sunlight coming through the back of the bag. So I was very happy and quiet, and we love that from a young child, right? And then my dad grabbed a potato chip, and suddenly I was screaming and crying because I think I was half asleep. Whatever it was like an eclipse of the sun for me. And I was shocked by that shadow. And my poor dad, of course, what happened? What happened? He was very gentle with me. Like I say, I don't know how he came to that. Where do you get? Because children are crazy, right? You may be drunk and have a crazy evening with some friend where you get in a big fight and they scream at you. You could get in a fight at a bar. But you don't usually live with someone for very long who will scream at you and cry and maybe kick you, do things that young children do every day. It's crazy. And it brings up a lot of reaction when you're dealing with this non-rational little human. So I don't know how he responded that way, but he did. And he hated it when he made me cry. He never yelled at me. He did say, I talked about this in Berlin, once I knocked over the lamp because I like to go to the corner by his typewriter and look out the window and see the birds and the cats and whatever. And careful! The cord from the lamp was strung, across to the electric socket. Be careful, don't break the lamp. So of course, eventually I tripped over the cord and the lamp fell down and broke. And all he said was, and I was in tears. When I was an infant, once my mom had something to do, probably going to a poetry workshop, who knows. That's mostly what she did when she wasn't working or other obligations. So she left me with him, and both of them thought that was fine. But I was crying, and if you have kids, there's those moments when the baby is crying endlessly, and you do all the things. Nothing works. Nothing works. You do all the things again that might work, and the baby's still crying and screaming, and so finally you give up. You either sit down with them or you put them down, take a break, collect yourself before starting again. So he put me down in my crib. They're kind of high sides. He was very tall, but it was usually my mom who put me down in the crib. So when he put me down in the crib, I dropped like an inch or two, maybe. And I kind of rolled on my side, so my arm was under a little bit. I was still crying, because that was ongoing for quite a while. And my dad thought he had broken my arm, which was impossible, right? So he was so afraid of something happening to me, and of course, in the worst case, that he would make me cry or hurt me in any way. But it was kind of miserable for him to be in charge at that time when I was a baby. It was much easier when they were older. My mom said when she came home that day, okay, I can't leave her with him. You're not going to stay on duty. Because they'll both be miserable. But I did spend a lot of time alone with him when I was older. And everything I remember about being with him, I have a really good feeling about it. I remember a picture, which is kind of a, with that thick paint like Abel showed us yesterday, and he painted this picture of what I thought was two women in the garden working, and main feature of the drawing, aside from making it clear that it's a garden and there's two people, is these two asses sticking up in the air as they're working down in the garden. They've almost like hearts, but that was on the wall. So I loved that painting so much. I was happy when I went to San Pedro when they moved into their new house, and there it was on the wall, and I mentioned to Linda, I always feel so good when I see that painting, because it's a connection to when I was with my dad when I was too young to really remember. But it's the association, right? And she said, I guess she gathered that I didn't know what the painting or who the painting was of, and she said, that's a painting of you and your mom. So I had completely misunderstood the painting, but I still love it. I often tell people he was a good father, but I don't really know what that means beyond, making me feel loved and safe. Ask me something, Linda.
Yeah. Did you happen to have had a chance, perhaps, to attend one of your dad's readings, and how did you experience being with him at readings, to see him from a different perspective, perhaps?
I wish I could remember. Here's what I can tell you. I was at his last poetry reading that he ever did in Hermosa Beach at the Sweetwater, and it was close to where we lived. Most of the readings he did were somewhere else when I was old enough to actually go to them, so I had never been to one of his readings. But of course, he told stories all the time. His poems tell stories. He told stories. He talked about life. He talked to me directly about things, and also I was used to being in the room and hearing him talking to people. That was a big part of it. That's probably why I like to sit and talk so much, because it's just one of my favorite things, especially if someone will tell a good story. But there would be nothing shocking for me there. I can't remember when I first read anything by him, but both my mom and my dad believed in sort of I don't know how to phrase it. You know, not exposing me to everything in a way that would be traumatic for a child, but just having a certain reverence for the truth, which includes that people like to have sex and that people often take a shit, and these were not taboo things, so it's not like there was any shock to that. And by the time I was at that reading, I definitely had read probably everything that was available to read until that time. So I can tell you now, I wish I was able to be at the movie when you played the movie of him giving his reading here in '78, because I admire the fact that he didn't like public speaking either, but he could do it. Maybe one of these days I'll try getting drunk and see if that helps. But I think you need to have the wit beforehand, right, to have the quick reaction. And I love how he would drop things in, and just the timing with the banter with the hecklers and everything. That always made me happy. And I was very sad when there was a moment after he died when we all gathered together in his living room, and John Thomas, who was another poet who I've known all my life and also liked to hold the center of the stage and tell stories, was there telling stories, and you know, we just had this feeling like sitting in front of a fake fireplace. You know, absolutely no criticism of John Thomas, but it made us all miss him even more, having someone else sit there and tell some stories about things they did together.
I wonder, was your father never yelling at you? Was he an idol and tried to be like him with your kids, or did it play any role in how, in case you wanted not to yell, did you succeed?
Good question. So, unfortunately, no. I didn't try to emulate that. I thought it was some kind of miracle, especially with the experience he grew up with. And yeah, I thought it was a miracle. I didn't really think that most people can have kids and not yell at them. And so my son Nikhil is here, and he'll tell you that I didn't yell at him too much because he's very nice. I wish I yelled at him less. But then I had my second child, and when something bothered her, instead of, you know, sort of being quiet the way I was when I was a kid and the way he was when he was my kid, she's loud. She will let you know what she's feeling. I wish she was here right now, but on the other hand, it's good, right? Because I'm not embarrassing my 13-year-old Clara here. And you know, she asserted her desire to not be yelled at as a human right. And I had to respect that and say, you know what? You're right. I'm not sure if I can do it, but okay, I'll try. And now she thinks I still yell at her because you know what happens. You lower the volume, but there's still times when you're frustrated and you use that mom voice and then go, Clara! And that's yelling. And it does make me laugh because it reminds me of my dad who didn't have that inflection, but even when he didn't use that voice, when he said, Marina, I felt that I had disappointed him. I knew I had disappointed him in some way when I heard that. So I still, you fine-tune your reactions too. But less yelling, it's good. I'm glad that at least one of my kids got to have a bit of that. I think most of my friends try and do things differently than their parents did. And I did have a time with my mom, because of course my mom did most of the heavy lifting of parenting. I lived with my mom, and I saw my dad like once or twice a week. It changed as I got older, right? So we saw him a lot when I was little, and then he would come and pick me up after school once a week when I was in school age, and then we would come visit him regularly when I was an adult. That's how it transitioned. But my mom was the one who was on duty full time, and he would tell me, it's really hard work being a mom. So you should go easy on your mom, okay? She's doing a hard job. And so he spoke about her with respect, and maybe that's something that I really emulate as much as I can. I have 2 kids from 2 different fathers. I'm divorced, and humans are really irritating. So of course I get frustrated and upset with both of their fathers. My mom didn't just raise me to think of Hank as an amazing writer, but as a really good person. And, that was something to both love about him and to aspire to myself. It set a high standard. And so, yeah, she supported my relationship with my dad in every way she could. And I wanted to do the same. But then, it's a little shocking when other people have other ideas of how divorced parents behave with each other. So it was rough on the dads because they had to face my high expectations of, this is our kid. What do you mean you're mad about whatever, money, taxes, life? You don't do that. You don't say negative things to each other in front of your kids. I failed at that a lot, but at least it was the right idea and the right direction to point myself into. Someone else. Hey, Clint.
Hey, I asked myself, when you would get older and started to get interested in boys, when you had your first boyfriend and stuff like that, was Hank a jealous father, or was he able to let go? Because that's the moment I'm afraid of when my daughter will be older.
How old is she now?
7.
Yeah. He didn't have that attitude. The only time when it came out, because I did start dating my first husband when I was 15, and then eventually when I was 25, we got married. I can't remember, 1989, however old I was. 89 minus 64. Okay, pretty good. Something like that. And my dad was always really kind and welcoming to Jeffrey, my boyfriend at 15, who, by the way, I'm sure this would be really upsetting to you. I know it would be upsetting to me. Jeffrey was 12 years older than me. So when I was 15, when I first started dating him, he was 27. I don't think most fathers would. Of course, they didn't meet for a while, but he knew about it through my mom. I talked to my mom about it. Mom told Dad. No negative feedback. They let me do what I wanted to do at that point in my life. And Jeffrey was really a very conventional person in most ways. He's from the Midwest, which is a more conservative part of the United States. He was very good looking. You know, there's a lot of things that maybe my dad would react to if he was going to and not like him, besides just the fact that he was my boyfriend, and so that water should be protected from the 27-year-old. But he was very kind to Jeffrey and never said anything negative to him or about him. The only time where even there was an inkling that maybe there was something there that he wasn't expressing was when he introduced Jeffrey to someone, because you know, a lot of times journalists or friends from far away would come and visit. We spent a lot of evenings sitting around drinking wine after dinner and talking with various people. So he introduced Jeffrey as my boyfriend, and then he kind of corrected himself and said, well, our current boyfriend. That didn't make Jeffrey feel too good. But that was the only glimpse into maybe, you know, he wasn't just delighted with the whole situation. I'm only absolutely certain that he behaved in the way that he wanted me to see, right? I have no idea if he actually liked Jeffrey or disliked Jeffrey. He's a very honest person. Unlike on my mother's side of the family, he didn't insist on speaking the truth just because it was true, whether you wanted to hear it or not. He was very kind and gentle. And so if he had disliked Jeffrey, I obviously liked him, so I never knew it. It were true. He must have liked him at least a little bit, because Jeffrey painted their house once when he was out of work, and I kind of shiver with horror thinking back on it now, because, you know, painters make noise in the morning. When you're hungover, your son-in-law waking you up, probably not good. And then Linda has really good taste, and you know, took a very cheap, boring-looking kind of cardboard box house and turned it into a home that they were comfortable in and a good place to live. And she did that by having good taste and by insisting that everything be done as well as it could be done. So I'm really not sure why we survived that without conflict as a family. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I decided if there's a pause where no one has any questions, then I'm going to read some of the poems that he wrote to me or about me. And he can probably tell you better what our relationship was like than I can. But also it might make you ask something. But I'd rather have a question, because you might have read those poems already. Anybody? Okay. Yes? It was not the daughter of celebrity when I was in school. No one knew who my dad was in the group of people who were at school, the parents of the other kids where I went to school. One person, when I was in my first year of after kindergarten in school, knew who my dad was, apparently, because he sent home a newspaper clipping with me to give to my mom about my dad, and that was the principal of the school. So, even though normally I I just had this experience of we're a very different family and no one understands us in the normal world. There were a few people then who knew who he was. And then, of course, I spent most of my time when I wasn't in school with my mom or with my dad and other people who were either interested in poetry or who were poets. So I didn't have, like playmates that I was talking with. I was talking to writers and, my playmates were adults or young adults. Neely Tchaikovsky was a good friend of my dad, and he was the one who, I don't know, as a teenage boy, I guess, was becoming friends with my dad and hanging out. And he was the one who told me about the tooth fairy. It's just a very different life than typical. Bohemian parents on both sides.
Your mom brought you to poetry workshops and did some writing too. Can you describe the kind of writing your mom did? It's not about Bukowski, but
I can almost hear you, but not quite.
I want to know what kind of writing your mom did.
Oh, what kind of writing my mom did? Well, she was a good poet. She wrote much shorter poems, not as, I'm not intellectual or a literature person, so I really don't have the right vocabulary to describe it, but I would say they both aspired to the same thing, which was to express whatever they wanted to express with as many words as they needed, but no more. Nothing extra. Just exactly what was needed to say what needed to be said. And, she wasn't successful as far as being published and so forth. But again, we lived in this little insular world of the Los Angeles poetry scene. So in that tiny world, everyone knew who my dad was, and my mom was well recognized and so forth. And that's how she came to meet him, right? She was actually restarting her life after a really terrible divorce, and she was in Detroit, and she found in some little bookstore, I don't know what publication it was, I wish I knew, but she found something and went, oh wow, I need to read more of this guy. And then her mom, my grandmother, lived in Los Angeles, so eventually in the struggle of not having a way to pay the rent or make a living after this ugly divorce, she moved to Los Angeles and she lived with her mom for a while. And she was writing letters to my dad at that point. And so, thanks to them both being writers, that's why I'm here. She was a fan. Oh yeah, and that's a good idea because also you can correct me if I didn't hear you correctly. Is there something that my dad taught me about life that's still with me now? About life in general. It's still relevant. There's still something that I use. I think so. But not the kind of thing where you say, oh, well, I'll tell you what he taught me that I did not use. He used to tell me, never trust a man who smokes a pipe. That was a fatherly saying, that would tell you like it's a thing that you should learn. I think it was just something funny to say, but I do it sideways. People with the pipe, with the really heavily scented tobacco. I'm not a fan, so I guess I still hold that. But I know we all get different things out of his writing. wasn't falling down drunk or vomiting or having sex with other people while I was around. But it was something that he would talk about or get arrested. You know, those weren't like dirty secrets in the closet. Those were all things that he talked about just the way he wrote about it. So how you react to what happens to you kind of implies an approach to life. And I don't know what that's called. You know, I mentioned Camus the other night, and I only read one book by Camus. I read The Stranger when I was a teenager, and I thought it made a lot of sense to me. So is this what existentialists are about? Okay. Seems kind of basic, but it makes sense, yeah. And I heard later that The Stranger was the only book of Camus that my dad liked, and all those he disliked. But you know, maybe you could call it Zen in a way, as what I took from, except for I'm from California, so I hate to have all let's romanticize Eastern philosophy and work, but you know, the experience, the moment is what it is. And I did not bring this poem with me, but I remember him telling the story many times of waking up after spending the night sleeping on a park bench. Of course, hungover, but also just, you know, it's not really, I've never tried it, but I'm pretty sure it's not the most enjoyable time of your life when you're sleeping on a park bench and you wake up and you slept on the park bench all night. But there was something about that morning. It wasn't exactly joy. I'm not a writer, so I won't try and recreate his words, but he found something in that moment that was profound, or that made it worth being alive through all the other moments that were so uninteresting or painful. Just that one moment. And so I guess, you know, I expect that from life, that there's going to be little gems that appear if you look for them. Someone else was over here, had a question. Yes?
That might be too personal, but...
Nothing's too personal. I will refuse to answer if it's too personal, but please ask.
How aware were you of the drinking?
Where was I?
How aware?
How aware were you of the drinking going on?
Oh, very aware. When I was young, I was aware because we lived in the same house, right? But that I don't remember because I was only just over 1 year old when I moved out with my mom. And again, back to the theme of my mom always nurturing and protecting my relationship with my dad. When I asked her what happened, she always said that she left. And I figured there was probably more to it than that. But she never would say anything negative about my dad as far as a reason for leaving. She said it just, it just couldn't work. He was working at the post office all night, trying to sleep in the daytime, and I was crying 24 hours and he couldn't write. Much later as an adult, I found out that, they were both miserable, but he was, of course, the one who said, this isn't working, you're going to have to get out. But she would have never told me that because, of course, I would have, as a young child, I would have been loyal to her, and that would have put a little separation between me and my dad. And that was between him and her. So after we were living somewhere else, then I wasn't around him when he was drunk. But it was still something I knew about because drinking was an important thing to him in his life, right? It really mattered to him. He never wanted to stop drinking. So he would talk about it. My mom didn't drink, but she didn't have anything necessarily against it unless you're destroying your life, right? I mean, she was in love with my dad, so she probably couldn't have too much against drinking. Doesn't make sense. So I always was aware of his drinking and also of his tendency to, make a scene because they're all stories. So I grew up hearing the stories. It wasn't all the nice, just like when you read his books. It wasn't all the nice stories of something that's really acceptable and sunny and you might want to tell your little daughter about what you did yesterday. He told the story of whatever he did yesterday. If he got arrested for drunk driving, that was the story. So I knew all about it all the time. When I was an adult, then we would go over and drink wine together. By that time, he wasn't drinking in bars. Life was a little more calm, so there weren't as many scenes. But I didn't stay so late to see all of them either.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking questions. I really appreciate it a lot. Even while you're asking them, I don't know still what you want to know, but I really enjoy sharing these stories, and I would love to, just pretend like I'm with one of you having a beer and we're chatting. Oh.
What did you want to become when you were growing up as a child, being in that poetry bubble? What profession did you want to have in the future?
Well, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and that was a problem, because I really thought, my mom and my dad always knew that they wanted to write. It wasn't necessarily a profession, right? They started writing long before there was any hope of having it be something that paid, and it never was for my mom. But it's not even sensible, really, to be a poet and think, oh, I should be a poet, that's how I'm going to make a living. No one ever starts that way, right? They had to write, and you did. I didn't have anything that I had to do, so I was at a loss. But I didn't like when we couldn't pay the rent on time, when Mom got really late on the rent. I was embarrassed, or when we were in the, just as a typical teenager or typical little child being embarrassed by the parents who are so human. And I'm really grateful to my kids for not being embarrassed by me, because I am embarrassing, trust me. But I didn't like that feeling of being shown up and again as being a really shy person, at the grocery store, and you grab your groceries and then you have to put some stuff back because you can't pay for everything. I just hated that. So since I didn't know what I wanted to do, I was doing okay in school in science and math, which I used to hate. So I figured, well, I'll become an engineer because it doesn't sound terrible. I'm okay with that part, and they pay people for doing this. So I'll be able to pay the rent on time. And that has worked out. I almost always have paid the rent on time, and if I was late, it was just due to my distraction. I still wonder what I'm going to be when I grow up, maybe like my mom, who never made a living as a writer. She finally retired, and then she could really focus on her life as a writer, and she was a much happier person then. I have better jobs than she had. She was a waitress and a clerk typist. People don't treat you that well, so at least I get paid and I get treated well. I would love it if I wake up someday with some inspiration, but meanwhile, with these, for me, it's the sun and the moon, we're there already, so who needs to do that? So I'm here to appreciate the world as a consumer of wonderful things. Did you want to ask something?
Yes.
No.
I always thought that when you were a young child, that your mother was moving around, I have this idea of the hippie life, because obviously I only know a few of the letters and a lot of other people over on constructions in a camp somewhere. So I have no real idea how much or how often you have seen your dad through the childhood as a whole.
Right.
There are times when you have regularly, and I have no idea if you've been on the road for 5 years or.
I was never on the road for that long, but you're right. Those are the things that are in the letters, right? Because that was remarkable. I was somewhere else. It made my dad anxious when my mom took me to a commune in New Mexico. We were living not only far away, but in a very different place. And none of us had enough money to go back and forth between California and New Mexico, so we basically didn't see him while we lived there. But we lived there for one summer, and that's the longest I ever went without seeing my dad. I got letters from him, and I sort of, just took it for granted. So there was a lot going on, moving to a commune where people were trying to farm their own food, coming from Los Angeles. But also before I started school, she did move around a lot, but it wasn't away from where my dad was. So those days I always saw my dad. When she first moved out, she moved to an apartment that was walking distance from his apartment because she didn't have a car. And so, she would walk me over to visit him, or he would come over to visit me. Mostly, she had a really small room, so mostly we would go to visit him in his little apartment on Delongre Avenue. There was a courtyard, and it was a cheap little apartment, but as a kid, it felt like going to Dad's house, kind of like when you go to Grandma's house. It's really an established place, and also probably because when my mom ran out of money, living on welfare at that time, because she was taking care of me, so she was being, receiving welfare to pay the rent and buy food, and she would run out of money at the end of the month. And does welfare make sense in, how do you say welfare in German? So we would go, when we didn't have any food, we would go to him and he would feed us both. And that's after the separation. And then when she moved, finally when I was starting school, before that we moved to be with my grandmother for a while, so that was further, that was Anaheim. But it wasn't too far to visit, even without a car. The very first night she met him, Anaheim is like where Disneyland is. It's in a different place than Los Angeles, but it's all sort of part of the same giant city. And probably a 3-hour bus ride from Anaheim to Hollywood, where my dad lived. And, the first night she met him, she took the 3-hour bus ride when he called her and said, "You have to come over here. I need you." Okay, I'm coming. She got me to wherever I needed to go to see him. And then when we moved to Santa Monica later, which somehow she managed to live in little apartments in Santa Monica, we still moved all around, but I was always in the same school, and I was always basically the same distance from my dad, so I would see him once or twice a week. He would pick me up after school. For a long time, we would go in this little blue VW bug, and we would go to McDonald's and get, a hamburger burger and fries, which I loved, of course, because any food associated with Dad, good stuff. Eventually, he got tired of eating McDonald's, and Linda, much later, led him to eating higher quality food, so we dropped the McDonald's thing. When I was a teenager, he would come and pick me up, and we would go visit his friend Steve Richmond, who was also a poet and an interesting person. And they would talk. Sometimes I was part of the conversation. Sometimes I was doing, reading my book or doing a puzzle or something like that. So it's not your typical dad visits, but as long as he was telling stories, I was happy.
What I always loved was when he first met me, we talked about your experiences with your dad, and that it was so totally different from the public image of the tough guy. That was really heartwarming, really story, but part of it and before from his own writings and his letters.
Right.
Particularly, I remember when you were a really little child, it must have been about, 4 or something, surely you could not read, but in a letter to your mom, he added a section that was for you, so she would read it to you. And the things like, if you cross the street, look both ways, and he put a capital letters. And that passage ended with the words, something like I don't have it exactly, but it's not forgotten. But I love you more than the sun and the trees and the mountains and I don't know what not, but that was so beautiful. Can you tell about something related to experiencing?
Only a little bit, right? I can tell you a little bit about what it was like to be treated like that, to be loved like that. From a writer and a storyteller to express his love to you as a father is actually probably better at it than your average dad wanting to say I love you. But I love hearing those words from you. I love you more than the sun and the trees and what else did you say? The sky or something. That's how I felt. I felt love like that all the time, and I can't remember those words because I took it for granted at the time. Especially before I started school, because then your main influence and how you see the world is more shaped by your parents, right? So I really thought I was very special. Of course, I thought my father and mother were very special too, but I felt like some kind of magical being because that's how they talked to me. And at the same time, all the grit and the grime and the hangovers were there too, right? So it's not like magical in some fanciful sense. It's more magical in the way that we're all magical, right? I mean, what the hell? How are we all so different? And a lot of us really interesting. There's so many humans, it seems like. How are we special and individual? But I felt that I was exactly that. I remember when I was really little, I had this idea, we're talking like 3 years old, I thought I created the world. So that's what this inspired. I thought I was some sort of version of the creator for a while. And I still have that with me. I'm very shy and self-deprecating and afraid of being judged by the world now. But I got that from society, I got that from being in school. I didn't get that from my parents. So I'm glad I have the other part in me too. And I do have a poem that I have hanging on my wall. It's not, I don't think it's commonly published, but it's not unknown either. It was one of these broadsides that John Martin printed and Barbara did the artwork or the graphic design for. And actually, let me pause here for a moment before I read this poem and talk about John Martin, and maybe Linda too. They're family. I love John Martin. He was in my life as someone who saved my father's life from working at the post office. He was in my life as someone who gave him a chance to actually spend his life, his waking hours, doing something that was important to him, instead of trying to choose between, drinking and working low-wage jobs and suicide, and that balance. And so, I love John Martin. I can't explain why those things happened. These are facts. And I think, Ronnie, you remember in Berlin that I looked a little bit pale and shocked when we were first talking about all those changes, because it is shocking. But it doesn't change a bit how I feel about John Martin. And even as an adult, he was really caring and nurturing to me, and also he was a friend to my dad as well as his publisher. And those were separate relationships, but sometimes life is hard, and especially if the part of life that's hard is your marriage that day, it's good to have someone else you can always talk to. And for me, that was my mom, sometimes my dad, later my ex-husband. I had those people in my life. For him, at least for a while, that was John Martin. And so I can't separate those things. I just know this is true, and this is true also. And Abel told me that he has his email address, so I'm going to get back in touch. And I won't be doing it to interrogate him, although I certainly will be curious as to what happened. We'll see. Also, Linda is a very difficult person. My dad didn't say much about my mom because, again, there were some truths that could be spoken, but they didn't have to be because it would be hurtful, right? So he probably lived longer thanks to Linda. She had a health food restaurant, and she got him eating healthier food, drinking wine instead of hard liquor, various subtle changes that who knows what would have happened without her. But she did seem to be a nurturing, stabilizing influence for him in his life. And remember that part about how he made me feel like I love you more than the sun. I can never, ever do enough for Linda because she gave me my dad for more years of my life. None of the years since he died have been, quite the same without him. It kills me that he didn't kids. So she's difficult. I love her, and I appreciate her, and I'm eternally indebted to her. And hey, what kind of woman would have been in a relationship with my dad? Not someone who was a shy, delicate flower and couldn't, it had to be someone else who could understand mental health struggles as well as just life being difficult. So I love them both very much and appreciate them, even though, like probably a lot of you have family members who do things that you really wish they didn't do. That's also true. So I was going to read this poem, Love Poem to Marina, which I have hanging on my wall. I wouldn't say it's my favorite poem, but it's does make me feel good. I usually have it somewhere near the front door or near the kitchen, somewhere where you go all the time, because it makes me feel good just to see it there. Love poem to Marina. My girl is 8, and that's old enough to know better or worse or anything. So I relax around her and hear various astounding things about sex, life in general, and life in particular. Mostly, it's very easy. Except I became a father when most men become grandfathers. I'm a very late starter in everything. And I stretch on the grass and sand, and she rips dandelions up and places them in my hair while I doze in the sea breeze. I awaken, shake, say, "The hell?" And flowers fall over my eyes and over my nose and over my lips. I brush them away, and she sits above me, giggling. Daughter, right or wrong, I do love you. It's only that sometimes I act as if you weren't there. But there have been fights with women, notes left on dressers, factory jobs, flat tires in Compton at 3 a.m. All those things that keep people from knowing each other, and worse. Thanks for the flowers. For me. I couldn't do it without you.